short, but I do just want to foreground the panel and the discussion today. This is a conversation that, people have been having in anthropology and in Black studies for decades now. And we wanted to sort of continue the conversation, particularly from some junior faculty members and grad students, and expand the conversation across the 4 fields to talk about anthropology across the 4 fields and Black studies across the 4 fields together. And as a result of that, maybe we'll have some insights that we can take forward and enact into the world. So without further ado, I want to introduce the rest of the panelists. I'm just going to give very brief descriptions, and they will give you more in-depth descriptions about who they are as well. I will start with Delande Justinville, who is currently a graduate student at American University, a biocultural anthropologist. We have Dr. Ayanna Flewellen, currently assistant professor at UC Riverside in anthropology, and she is an archaeologist. We've got Dr. Justin Hosby, who is assistant professor at Emory University and a cultural anthropologist. And we've got Dr. Tiffany Jones, who is at William Rainey Harper College in anthropology, and she is a linguistic anthropologist. So thank you all for being here today and for engaging in this conversation with us. It's going to be sort of conversation style, so I really just want to kick it off with a question that any of you can pick up, and we can hopefully shop it around and continue the conversation. For anybody in the audience who wants to ask questions, we ask that you use the Q&A feature to pose your questions, and we'll try to incorporate those into the discussion as well. So to kick off the conversation today, I know many of us are recently out of PhD programs or possibly in PhD programs. And we often had to grapple with this issue of engaging in Black studies in departments that didn't fully understand how Black studies articulated with the work that we did. So I'm wondering, on one hand, what are some of the texts and some of the people that you pulled from in Black studies in relation to your own works? And then on the other hand, what are some of the challenges you all faced, and whether that was methodologically or institutionally, in incorporating Black studies work and theorization into your work? And I just ask, as you answer the question, please state your name and a brief physical description of yourself.
I guess I'll hop on. So, hi, my name is Ayanna Omilade Flewellen. I am a Black woman wearing red sandcast beads. I have on clear glasses, red lipstick, short Black haircut. Behind me, I'm in my kitchen nook, so I have all my teas and artwork and elixirs that keep me well behind me. Wanting to just say a huge thank you for the platform to really have this discussion, especially coming from the 4 different subfields. I feel like I often am not in conversation with a lot of people from other subdisciplines, so I'm grateful for that. So just to talk a bit about my own experience, I actually got my MA in African and African Diaspora Studies, and I got my PhD in anthropology with a focus in African Diasporic Archaeology at the University of Texas at Austin. And one of the reasons why I got my MA in Black Studies is really I had a real conviction coming out of undergrad from the University of Florida to have a real firm grounding in Black studies and Black theory, Black feminist scholarship specifically, to be able to do archaeological research, because I felt like there was such a huge lag, even within the classes that I took at the University of Florida that focused on African American life and history. So as I was looking for PhD programs, not only was I looking at departments or anthropology departments, but I was looking at universities who had anthropology departments that did African diaspora archaeology, but also had a really thriving Black studies program, and there aren't many. And then based on that very sort of like strict desire of mine, I actually reached out to who would become my advisor, Maria Franklin, and talked with her about what I needed in a department, and we came together to create a link program where it was built into my admission letter that I would get an MA in Black Studies and then a PhD in the anthropology department. So I did a lot of intentional groundwork as an undergrad to ensure that the graduate school education that I was seeking was going to be able to fulfill my own needs. And in regards to the sources that I pull from, wow. So I'm pulling from Black Geographies, so Catherine McKendrick. I pull heavily from Saidiya Hartman, from Tina Camp, from other social historians like Jessica Marie Johnson, Maria Fuentes. I'm pulling from Toni Morrison, and really just sitting with like critical fabulation within my work as well. Zora Neale Hurston and her, background as an anthropologist and the ways in which she brought that into her literary work. And also I'm sitting with the memory of like Black women during the WPA Workers Administrative Project who worked on Native American sites and excavated at Irie Mound in the sort of early 20th century in my work as well. So that's just some of what I'm pulling from.
Well, I can jump in here if that's okay. So my path is really unique, to say the least. I started off in English with my first master's. Yes, I've been in school forever, and thankfully I'm done. And in doing that and working in the writing center there, I was the only Black student, and I started hearing these buzzwords around African American vernacular English, and really not aware of what it really meant and how it impacted people's learning, how people's instructions factored in. And I started trying to really chase that rabbit down the rabbit hole, and decided, since I don't know anything about it and this is describing my language, I need to. And I took classes by a linguist, Dr. Mary Ziegler, who became my thesis advisor. And that really sent me on the path to really delving into African American language as a focus. And in doing so, as I was thinking about getting my PhD, I knew I wanted to go more the linguistics route. So I was shopping around schools, but similarly to what Ayana said, is that I didn't really see that you had a broad range of access to African American scholars in these departments. And so I got the advice that University of South Carolina had Dr. Tracy Weldon, and they were like, go. But in doing the work there, I found myself limited in trying to study Black language because I got pushback of, can you prove this is race driven? How can you quantify race? This needs to be more scientific. And that kind of led me away from just pure linguistics to Linganth, thankfully. But in doing so, I found that I didn't have grounding in the canon, so to speak, because I came to Linganth later and I came to anthropology later. So where I'm drawing from comes out of my interest in African American language and all the AAL scholars that I got along the way. Of course, like the Geneva Smitherman, but also like Elaine Richardson, and some of which I found that were also schooled through anthropology, like Marceliana Morgan, H. Samuel Alim. But as I came over to anthropology and I didn't have access, especially in looking at ethnopoetics and looking at Linganth, I didn't have the same pool that I was drawing from. And it wasn't until my dissertation, when I'm writing about Black people from an anthropological perspective, that I realized I was lacking. And it took me like doing dedicated work to find those scholars, and I'm still lacking because I'm still new to that. And of course I'm bringing from like Laith Mullins and Faye Harrison, but then newer people who are looking at urban spaces and specifically Washington DC, which is where my research is. I looked at Brandy Summers and Sabia Prince. And so, and of course in linguistic anthropology, I was looking at Lanita Jacobs. So I'm pulling from so many areas, but then I still get the pushback of, are you anthropology enough, right? Or are you language enough? And okay, thank you. We know that you're Black now. Where's the canon? And don't bring your discipline in the classroom because we need you to learn the canon. So I keep getting that push-pull. And that Geneva Smitherman talks about. So I'm having to really figure out, and even though anthropology is multidisciplinary, where I fit and how to bring in all the interests that I have, and as well as participate in citation politics of making sure I cite Black people and then cite Black women. And I'm sorry, I realized I did not give my introduction. I'm Tiffany Marquis Jones, Dr. Marquis Jones. I am a Black female. I have on, you can't really tell, but it's a blue vest and a blue sweater. I have a lovely background that is not mine. I wish this was my apartment. It's green wallpaper with a white lamp, and I have locks. I'm a natural sister. But yes, that's my hopefully starting to the contribution and conversation about this.
Thank you, thank you. Somebody else want to hop in?
So I'll hop in. My name is Justin Holsby. I'm African American man. I have on a yellow button down shirt, and I have a blue background behind me. Um, and yeah, I think about Black studies and anthropology and my own kind of disciplinary training. You know, Dr. Faye Harrison was my mentor and my graduate advisor. So, you know, from day one, Dr. Faye Harrison really kind of taught me the importance of citational practice and also citational politics, and the importance of also looking back behind what is considered the anthropological canon and kind of revealing the layers of kind of Black scholarship within anthropology that's often gone kind of unremarked throughout our own history. And I think it's similar that kind of like the Black presence in anthropology is similar to the Black presence in Western philosophy and Western civilization. It's always ubiquitous, but also always left unmarked in some way, unmentioned. So I think in my own work, you know, with Dr. Harrison, from day one, I was reading Philadelphia Negro, I was reading St. Clair Drake's Black Metropolis, I was reading Elena Padilla, I was reading the work of Hortense Powdermaker. So I think that from the beginning, Dr. Harrison really taught me the importance of looking back to our ancestors and seeing it as kind of an ancestral citational practice, in a sense, for me to kind of think through how have Black people contributed to ethnography or ethnology, and then kind of what are the ways in which we critique the mainstream canon of what anthropology is and kind of how it's existed over time. So I think in my own research now, I really do think through the work of course, Faye Harrison's work, of course, the work of Sylvia Winter, the work of Sadia Hartman, the work of Tina Camp as well, because I think that part of what I think Black studies bring to bear is a critique of Western civilization, in a sense. And I think that that's kind of the tension. I think maybe Tiffany, what you talked about in your own kind of experiences, that it seems that in many ways, anthropology is kind of an intellectual register for Western civilization itself. And Black studies is a critique of that. So even bringing that into the discussion, it's an immediate critique of everything that we've been taught. I think that, you know, oftentimes we're taught about kind of this anti-racist history of anthropology vis-a-vis Franz Boas's liberal anti-racism. And part of the issue with that is I think that if we can look at that in great relief now, 100 years later, can we reconsider that as not some kind of like radical intervention into kind of like the ways of thinking through the human and inhumanity, but about maybe a recapitulation of the terms of, you know, Black non-humanness perhaps, or the non-humanness of non-white people. I think that in many ways, the elision post-Boas of kind of racial study, I think that in many ways is given kind of a smokescreen for, okay, we're not racist, we're anti-racist, actually looking for Franz Boas. And I wonder, can we consider the ways that perhaps Franz Boas's intervention actually just recapitulated the terms of a kind of racial marked ordering of humanness? I think that the fact that anthropology right now is majority a white discipline, where you have majority white people going to non-white environments, not exclusively, but the dynamic is white people going to non-white environments globally and rendering culture intelligible, in a sense. And I think that that dynamic itself is the central issue in tension that makes, I think, Black studies and anthropology, I think in many ways, I see them as kind of not clashing, because I think that in many ways, Black studies is a critique of the idea of kind of that kind of order, the kind of racial ranking ordering of humanness. And I think that, you know, even if it's implicit or explicit, anthropology has contributed to that by the racial dynamics of our field, of who's allowed to do what research. And I think that also plays into why the research of non-white scholars gets siloed so much, is because I think that, you know, in many ways, legitimacy is kind of, you know, inferred by the white anthropologist going to a non-white environment. And I think that that's something that with Black studies, I think that has caused me to question everything about anthropology and ethnography itself. And I think that, you know, I think about Antonin Fermin, the Haitian ethnologist, kind of responding to Arthur de Gobineau's Inequality of the Human Races as kind of like the foundational text to kind of say from the beginning, this endeavor was always flawed.
Alrighty, I'll go next. My name is Delon Justinville, pronouns he, him, his. African-American, male identifying. I'm wearing black framed glasses with a green coach jacket with some black print on it. My background is full of plants. I don't know how else to describe it. You know, they bring me peace in these tumultuous times. So with regard to the challenges that I face incorporating Black studies into my own work, for me, the incorporation itself has been and still is the greatest challenge. I can still recall times in undergrad where, you know, I began to inquire into how I can mobilize human biology as a way of critiquing race and colonialism, only to be met with responses such as, "That's interesting," or "I don't know anyone doing that," or even from bioanthropologists receiving some advice to be careful, we don't really do that anymore. It's safer to just not speak about race as a bioanthropologist. It's tricky and difficult terrain to navigate. So that was when that was. But even now, as recently as last month, I'm having conversations with colleagues and collaborators where we're discussing, this way of like, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like a Rubik's Cube of language where we're twisting and turning and shifting and spinning our words so that, because there are still these scholars who, when they hear the terms, race, Blackness, diaspora, they stop reading, they stop listening, they just go through this entire like sensory shutdown because these aren't the types of interventions that we do as scientists. We're empirical, we're positivist, we do these facts, which are just, as we know, not the truth. So it was a hurdle, still is a hurdle, and it still functions as a barrier very often. But in terms of the texts that I have found most relevant to my research, that's really helped me navigate through and around these hurdles. I actually don't know where I would begin or even end with like just the list of relevant texts. But what I can say about, texts that were the most relevant in setting me on the path to where I am now, I would have to say, honestly, Lose Your Mother by Assac Hartman and Exceptional Violence by Deborah Thomas, both of which I believe sit at this intersection of anthropology and Black studies. Lose Your Mother I find to be incredibly ethnographic. And I read these two texts back to back during a time where I had all but let go of applying to graduate school, having been convinced that the questions that I want to ask, I couldn't ask, and the research that I want to do, I couldn't do. But I was very fortunate. I was working in a Black Studies department at Brandeis University, and my then colleagues, Faith Smith and Jasmine Johnson, introduced me to these two texts, and I just became immediately like subsumed within their projects. Exceptional Violence, it's so amazingly how it's laid out through these different registers of the body and across various scales of analysis, and how it advances kind of entanglement of violence, historicity, belonging, and economy that I hadn't yet seen before. And of course, Lose Your Mother has pushed me to question notions of genealogy and geography, has pushed me to think more critically about the empirical nature of how we think about kinship across space and time, and even how the self figures into our own work, thinking of auto theory and autoethnography. So they really pushed me to begin asking these questions around Blackness, the body, and biology. And I didn't feel the need to wait for a faculty cosign anymore, for someone to tell me that this is the work I could be doing. And it's from asking these kind of questions that I then came into the work of Michael Blakey, Leslie Rankin Hill, and even the work of my own current advisor, Rachel Watkins, who I'm just so grateful for. Her own work builds through these intersections, and she understands and sees my vision and helps and guides me to the place I'm trying to go with this kind of work I'm trying to do, with decolonizing or cooperating towards a more decolonial science in and around the intersections of Black studies and anthropology.
All right, this is Justin Donovan again. I'm wondering, based on this conversation around texts, it seems like a lot of the sort of Black study has been built around sort of individual engagement, or to some degree community engagement outside of the institution. So I'm wondering to what extent perhaps institutions or maroon spaces, quote unquote, and I should mention that this panel is co-sponsored by the Association of Black Anthropologists and by the Society of Black Archaeologists. And also I'm wondering to what extent maybe your work in community organizing, if you've been engaged in community organizations previously or currently, what degree does that influence the work that you all do in the ways that you engage Black studies and engage anthropology? It's sort of a deep question. I know. I didn't.
Well, community. When I think community engagement, sometimes I have to remind myself that it doesn't have to be this like as large as like Black Lives Matter. It can be as small as like mentoring and service in my own neighborhood But one of the things that I'm really passionate about is actually mentoring the next generation of people behind me, people who don't have access to anthropology, people who don't have access to anthropology that look like them, and also bringing anthropology to the public. And one of the things, it's not necessarily a large scale movement yet, because I'm trying to, get my career started and just become new faculty and things of that nature. And thankfully, I'm in a university. I'm at a community college that allows me to really do a lot of work in DEI and diversity, of equity and inclusion. And, looking at this notion of social justice teaching and training other teachers about inclusivity and how to bring in inclusive pedagogies and things of that nature. And both of those are like areas that I'm really delving into. And one of the things I'm noticing in being a new faculty member at Harper College is, I'm the only anthropologist. So I'm the first face that, I'm the first face of anthropology that many people will see. I am clear, as a Black woman, I'm one of the few people that are in the social sciences there. So I get pulled in a lot of directions, like, hey, we need a Black opinion here. We need this here. We need, a face here. And so I've been really trying to figure out how to fuel that in terms of, okay, how can I shape that into a practice that I can then use to train other future teachers of anthropology? How can I engage teachers outside of anthropology and maybe bringing anthropology into the classroom, especially as it pertains to race and things of that nature? And in doing so, thank you, Dr. Baker. And in doing so, it has challenged me too to kind of be the same solution I'm trying to fix, and also to make sure that I am engaging with the works that aren't always cited, that aren't always given their due. And how I do that, like when I'm doing presentations, and I got this from a sociologist, and I mentioned this in another panel, to make sure I show the faces of the people that I'm doing, so that they see Black bodies, they see they're coming out, they know they're dealing with Blackness and Black voices and the experiences of everyday Black people, but also Black scholars. And I make sure I post their work, and I show, that in my bibliography, and I show that then, of course, in my curriculum and what I include. So that in some ways I can't help shape other people's experiences without doing that myself. But also then in mentoring and really trying to ground this sort of network of Black women in the discipline and really trying to reach out, it helps me kind of also think, who do I need in my squad that can mentor me? And by reaching and looking ahead of me to other Black scholars and other Black women, and getting involved in the ABA and things of that nature, so that I can build, my network. That also helps me kind of think, these are people I need to know, but also these are people I need to cite. These are people I need to read. These are people I need to teach. And I can say that one of the biggest things of really focusing in on mentorship, getting my own and then mentoring other people, have made me also have a greater conversation about Cite Black women. And I actually did a podcast on that, shameless plug, about how far we've come. We've come a long way, or have we, with David Simmons, with Irma McLaurin, and with the newly Akanebu. And what we were talking about is, when you're the only person in a department, especially if you go into a PWI, and you feel this need to kind of of course you're dealing with that insecurity about, if you're the only person, am I doing enough? Am I, activist enough, again, anthropology enough, learned enough, well-versed enough, whatever the case may be? Sometimes you find yourself doing this dance that isn't necessarily productive to some of the work that you're interested in. But in making sure I craft a community of mentors and mentees, it keeps me conscious about the kind of work I want to engage in, and the kind of people that I want to teach, and the kind of people I want to share to the next generation. And then when they see anthropology, it isn't just the dead white men's course, It is the now and then the next of scholars of color, but of Blackness, and topics about Blackness. And so that's been one of my ways my passions has fed into my pedagogy, and then my interest in really engaging or creating a community for myself then helps me as a scholar and a teacher as well, if that makes sense.
I think to add on to Tiffany's comments, Justin, your question made me think of one of the first readings that I had in a seminar taught by Faye Harrison many, many moons ago when I was an undergraduate at the University of Florida. And she made us read a piece by Sinclair Drake that talked about his activism as being strategically within his discipline and doing this in the sort of within the realm of academia. And I think about that as we're all like moving through this space and answering the calls to be involved in the social movement that's unfolding in front of us, but also understanding where our lanes are. And we all have different lanes. And I feel like the lane that I've been pushing the hardest in has been with the creation of the Society of Black Archaeologists, working alongside you, Justin, and really pushing forward a number of different initiatives that are not only speaking directly to the subdiscipline of archaeology, but are really having expansive conversations about empowering people, working alongside people, working alongside communities to be cultural stewards of their own heritage and history. So I feel like that's a space where I do a lot of my work. And I also feel like the work around, creating and foraging spaces where historically disenfranchised students have come into contact with archaeology, like the grant that we have with the University of California system, the HBCU initiative, to actually bring students from HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, down to St. Croix and have a 5-week field season when at these HBCUs, most of them, if they do have an anthropology department, very few do not have an archaeology class or program to really give them an introduction to this subdisciplinary space, get not only a crash course in how to do this work, but also have a $3,000 stipend to go alongside it, have their college application fee waived if they apply for a UC school, and then also have this fantastic opportunity to have funding should they be accepted into a program. It's a fantastic platform. So like that's one particular space where I feel like the activism, or not even activism, but the work that I do to create the kind of discipline I want to be a part of and the kind of space that I want to work in that feels like it's liberatory for me and for people who look like me. And then the other thing is actually looking at the classes that I teach and doing that sort of hands-on work of making Black liberatory futures a part and central to my coursework. I'm teaching a class right now called Feminism, Gender, and Archaeology. I don't have any Black students in that class because we only have 2 Black students in our anthropology department at UCR. So like that's one thing. So it's also like, the students that I come in contact with on a weekly and daily basis actually do not look like me for right now. That is shifting. But being in that class, bringing in Black feminist work, having that central to how we talk about feminist archaeology is a space of creating that sort of breathable air in my discipline that is necessary, not only for me to be able to be and live in that space, but also for the students who are in this department to actually have viable research as they go off and do their own disciplinary work. And to hear the students say that they have not had these readings in any other class that they've been in blew my mind. So I think there's also like, as Tiffany was mentioning, there are different sort of levels to how we can engage and do the work that's in response and in conversation with this current moment, and finding our lane and riding it till the wheels come off riding it.
Wonderful, thank you. And before we get to Justin real quick, I just want to remind people to please continue to drop questions in the chat. There has been a request from audience participants as well. If we could drop links in the chat. I know that it's kind of difficult doing 2 things at once, so maybe we can provide a sheet or some type of link access afterwards with ABA and SBA. With that said, sorry, continue, Justin.
I wanted to think of just the piece you mentioned from St. Clair Drake, Ayanna, and about, in many ways, I think Sylvia Winter has a piece called No Humans Involved. And in that piece, she cites, I think, Drake, and she says that St. Clair Drake said there are street tasks and there are intellectual tasks. I think that part of it is, I think as Black scholars, we understand that there are some tasks that are kind of intellectual tasks in terms of our pedagogy and our research, what we do via the university kind of formally, but then also there are some informal street tasks that I think that, you know, we are all involved in, particularly in terms of the movement for Black lives, and thinking about it really critically, how does our work figure into the current state of Black life right now? And I think that, you know, for me in my own research, when I went to New Orleans, I went initially to do a classroom ethnography of what it was like for people who were going to all charter schools after Hurricane Katrina. And then when I got to New Orleans, I kind of understood from talking to people and learning from different organizations and kind of Black women-led organizations in New Orleans, that really this is a fight over the right to the city and the fight for Black survival in Louisiana and in New Orleans. It's not just about schools being privatized and charter schools now. And so kind of reorienting my own thoughts and my own work to, okay, it's not just about this kind of one institution within the school, but about how there's kind of a complete suite of kind of institutions that are designed to strip away Black life from this geography. And they kind of cross-cut in different ways. And the school is one node of that overall process of kind of ethnic cleansing, and it's in a sense, ethnic removal of Black people from post-Katrina New Orleans in a sense. So part of it is thinking through, okay, then if that's the truth and if that's the case, that ups the ante a bit on what your work is, and ups the ante a bit on kind of what you hope to do with your work, because you can't just kind of go get your PhD, teach classes on this when you know that this is kind of life or death for many people who are actually living in the environments that you do work in. So I think part of it is thinking about, okay, what are some of the street tasks that we can engage ourselves in? I think that also thinking hyper locally, because, you know, I am in Atlanta now, and I'm from Atlanta. So that means that thinking about particularly what are some ways we could think through, especially thinking about what's happening now with the current pandemic. You know, food sovereignty is a really big issue for Black people and Black communities across the South, especially. So I think it's about now working with organizations to think about how can we kind of ensure that elders in our community or people who live in our community actually have access to food when they can't actually get on the bus to go to the grocery store, or if they can't find food in the way that they would before. So I think it's really, I think for me, I think about what are some kind of, not pragmatic, I think that the fight for Black life isn't pragmatic, so I don't want to reduce anything to pragmatic goals, because I think it's not pragmatic, but just kind of what are some ways that I can work in my community hyper locally, that I can be of support, and also still in my intellectual work and in my pedagogy as well, always kind of push the envelope on how people think about Black life and Black people and Black geographies. And I think part of that is, I think, as you said, Ayana, I teach a graduate section now, and these students they never read Sadia Hartman, they never read Sylvia Wynter, they've never read Frantz Fanon even. And I think about, wow, you really got to a PhD program in anthropology, but because of the silos of how kind of, you know, our work is circulated and spread and kind of cited, you can go through a whole graduate degree program and be kind of a professor and never have read Sylvia Wynter before. So I think I always just think about just how can I expose my own students to the work of Black scholars who've thought through these ideas. I think that in many ways, some of what we're articulating now has been thought through so many years prior by so many amazing Black scholars in the past. I think I read, it was W.B. Du Bois's, he gave a commencement speech at Howard University in the 1920s. And he was saying basically Bernie Sanders' 2016 platform in the 1920s and 30s. So I think that in so many ways we're responding to crises without historicity or ahistorically. I think that if we kind of go back to those classic texts and think through, you know, what were these scholars and Black scholars thinking about in their time period, you know, I find that to be so productive and so useful and fruitful for our work now.
That was wonderful, Justin. And that actually speaks to a question that Dr. Bert Louis had about, you know, the current moment in Black studies and anthropology. And I think it's worth noting that Sylvia's Wynter piece, No Humans Involved, was written in response to the Rodney King meetings. And so I think that, you know, definitely speaks to a lot of that current moment going on. Dylan, did you want to weigh in a little bit on that? Or?
Yeah, what I'll add quickly, Tiffany, something you said really resonated with me. You mentioned how the folks you work with keep you conscious. And so I'm from Boston, which, as most people know, is historically, contemporarily, incredibly racist. But I work with, I collaborate a lot with, and I work with local artists, and especially around queer spaces, queer art spaces for Black and brown youth. And the ways that they keep me sharp is when I'm talking about the work that I do or talking about how I'm entering a space, the questions they ask me continue to shift how I even come back to my work. You know, speaking of Sylvia Wynter, you know, she and Catherine McKittrick in Being Human Best Practice, they talk about science of storytelling, right? And back in Boston, I'm talking to one of my co-conspirators, and I'm talking my research, and like, oh, so you're using biology as a form of biography, a concept I have never thought about before. These are folks who are not, not academy affiliated or not doing a certain kind of reading that I'm doing, yet are asking the same kinds of questions and making the same kind of interventions that these scholars who have been in the academy for years are doing. So I really appreciate the work that the ways that I can come back to the work within the ivory tower, if you will, and reshape it. So reshape it through these interventions that folks who aren't inside are asking about, if that makes sense. Or even thinking about, the ways that the spaces that we put together, then I reframe how I think about the bodies that I study, how they created space, the body's role, their body's role in the production of space and environment that they inhabited. I'm able to reframe in more critical and broader ways the work that I do from the community-oriented engagements that I'm part of, which I'm so grateful for.
Thank you for that. This next question speaks more to institutionalization of Black studies and if it's even a possibility. I know there's been a lot of discussions around the need to let anthropology burn. There's also been other conversations around how to build Black studies in iterations into anthropology programs. In the Austin School Manifesto, Ted Gordon said, Black studies emerged out of the Black Power movement in this country. To continue to have salience both for the Black community and within academia, it must retain its activist and contestatory core, and in particular, its anti-racist project. On the other end, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have argued that the conditions of academic labor have been unconducive to study. And so if we are going to continue this work of developing and maintaining Black studies within the institution, what do you all think it would require, if it's even possible? That's a very loaded question. I'm sorry. It's like 3 questions in one. There's a separate book coming out, edited volume.
I guess I could take a stab. I could try and take a stab at it. I think that work needs to be done in multiple spaces within the institution. And I feel like, for instance, I came out of UT Austin. I opened up saying I got my master's in the Black Studies department there, and I got my PhD in the anthropology department there. When I graduated with my PhD from UT, I was one of the last students in their diaspora track. They also had an activist track in that department as well, and they had not had a student in that department for quite some time. So I feel like there's a way that people will talk about, UT's program as having like the golden years, which was really like the time in which the brilliance that was Ted Gordon, Joao Vargas, these people who were so seminal into building that Black Studies department at UT, built a flourishing African diaspora track in anthropology. And upon leaving that space to create breath and life in a Black Studies department, that work was not sustainable or up there, and it wasn't even sustainable like they somehow owed the anthropology department that work. It was the faculty in that department did not sustain that practice. There's intentional ways in which Black faculty were offered positions, but were not offered the correct amount of money that actually warranted a sustainable life in Austin, Texas. So I feel like there are ways that work needs to be done in both spaces. And I sometimes go back and forth between wanting a very flourishing and thriving Black Studies department, especially with desires for building that out at UCR, for instance, and also not allowing the development of that space to then be the excuse why these other disciplines, be it sociology, psychology, anthropology, English, geography, then don't do a practice of anti-racism, but strategically undoing practices of anti-Blackness in their own creation. And I feel like sometimes that's what happens, and it's not the work of Black faculty to attend to that. It's the work of non-Black faculty to attend to those spaces. So I feel like that work needs to be done in both spaces. To this point around connecting Black study within academia, there's a way, and I'm looking at Justin because I'm just like, we've both sort of been in conversation about this around like Robin D.G. Kelly's work, around how the sort of uptake of the Black Power movement and Black studies movement built out of the 60s and 70s, put into institutional spaces, then depoliticized it, and it was on purpose. So I also feel like there are departments, Black studies departments in this country that don't actually have Black faculty in them. Like that's a real thing. So I feel like there are ways that academia is constantly in this practice of consuming, commodifying, distorting the work of Black scholars. And it's our job as Black scholars who want to uphold liberatory practices rooted in Black activism, that we constantly are negotiating, fighting for that space. And it means really being creative and having, tactics of survival in a manner of different facets to really create liberatory futures for ourselves. So I think that's how I would like take a first stab at that very, very mouthy question.
Well, I'm glad you took a stab at it, because that gave me ideas. Because at first I was like, blank. And I mean, because it's a lot to process, but it's such a, in sitting here, and I'm trying not to sound or be or think cynically, I'm like looking at my experience. And just to give a little bit of background, I might get in trouble for this. So at my institution, you can look up what it is, where I graduated, I really wanted to get involved in, we didn't have a Black Studies department, at least I don't think we did, but I knew we had an African American Studies department, and I really wanted to get involved there. And we actually had anthropologists that were part of the faculty there, and I ended up getting a grant and a fellowship through the Institute of African American Research, which was great, because I was like, yay, I'm being accepted. But somehow there was this gap, and I couldn't seem to get over there. It was almost like every time I tried to push over there, no one wanted to say outright, well, she has these great classes here and these great professors here, but she wants Black stuff too, right? Like no one wanted to say that outright, as if that was like a dirty word, to want to have access to my own community and to people who look like me and were, working on communities of color, but working on specifically African Americans, which is what my research is grounded in. And that was tough, because I feel like I had to do this again, that dance of not saying outright what I wanted and what I needed, without looking like that I was privileging what is the problem of wanting to privilege your own community? I mean, as I'm saying that out loud, right? Because we want to share our experiences, but somehow I felt the need to work against that. So I had people who were my advisors fight for me and try to get that, but somehow they were like, no, she's good where she is. She has more there. She's fine. And also maybe because that's the critique of the school itself, right? Or the critique of the department that I was in itself. But then there was another opportunity at the time, was called the African American Professors Program. I was like, okay, finally, here's my chance. And I had a fellowship in social advocacy and ethics. And I was the only Black woman. And at the time there was a Black male, and it was kind of like, check and check. We got them. And I wanted to switch over to the African American Professors Program, because it was specifically trying to help those who were wanting to pursue the professorate. Clearly they were trying to work against that. Only 6% of all tenure faculty are Black, and they were going to mentor us. We were going to get to write in monographs. I forget what they call it, but we were going to get to publish together. And we were also going to, get sort of like access to these workshops and to people, to all the scholarship that we might not get otherwise. And I was so excited about that as I applied for that. But right away, one, not only did they say, okay, the African American Professors Program is too exclusive. We need to call it the Diversity Professors Program. And I'm like, really? That's what we're doing? And then that shifted to then, because it was already heavily Black, now white gay male became diverse, right? And so then on top of that, well, she has this awesome fellowship over there. let her stay there. And again, I just could not seem to, I could not bridge it. And then coming out and then trying to pursue my career and apply to Black Studies program, I kind of got the sense that because I didn't have Black Studies or African American Studies on my CV or as a, of course they would welcome anthropology, but I kind of felt like because I didn't have advisors who were Black or Black Studies somewhere stamped on my forehead, I could not even be received in those departments or even get a foot in the door. So everywhere that I seem to be thriving are in these non-Black spaces, so I don't know what has to happen. I'm probably posing more problems than anything, but I guess if anything, I want to share the experience of those who are stuck like me. And maybe for people who are listening to this conversation, when students come and they're like, they don't know how to say it, but they might need this, right? They're lacking this, and they need someone in the positions of power to fight for them and say, look, it's okay that they want to study Black people. It's okay that they are doing Native anthropology. That does not make them less scientific. And until we start to address those ideologies and that, toxic nature of way we look at, the fact that people who get social capital studying Black people are non-Black people. And I had to even think about myself of who I cite. When I had to think about the questions, thankfully Justin sent out, I was like, wait a minute, like, let me go get my books, because my discipline are mostly non-Black people talking about Black people in linguistic anthropology. So that's just something to think about. And it's not an answer, it's not a solution, but it's definitely something that needs to be in the forefront.
I think for me, I feel that anthropology and Black studies should always be in an antagonistic relationship with each other. It should always be antagonism. I think that we have separate goals. I think through kind of Cedric Robinson and his kind of, and I think Robin Kelly wrote this about Cedric Robinson, is that his framing of Black studies was that Black studies is a critique of Western civilization, okay? Anthropology, and I tend to agree with Ryan Jobson here, anthropology, it's in many ways, the racial terrain of anthropology itself renders it already compromised to me. And I think that's a question of the discipline itself, a question of ethnography as it's practiced in the United States as well. I think that, part of what has to happen is that, I don't want to be rendered fungible by being a Black person in an anthropology department, whereas now my job is now tasked with doing anti-racist work. I don't know about y'all. I have no desire to teach white folks to be anti-racist. That's not why I came to this. That's not why I do my research. And I have no desire to even publish about that, write about that, teach that. Yet I'm seeing now in this current moment, that's what I'm being tasked to do in so many different ways in so many different arenas. And I think that that's not what I want to do as a Black scholar. I think of Black studies in this kind of insurgent political objective of what that is. And that's liberation for not just Black people, but all people, all oppressed people. And I think that, in my own citational practice, I try to think through, okay, how can we think about these different connecting nodes of inequality and how to kind of deconstruct them and show the kind of epistemology and origins of them. But I think that part of that is that, I feel like incorporating Black studies into anthropology or having kind of that kind of where they're joined together in some kind of sense, I don't find that to be intellectually useful at all. I think that there should be always antagonism between Black studies and anthropology because they're separate and they're competing projects. I think that honestly, just in my own experience in anthropology, my own experience in the field, it's that anthropology is a white discipline. It's a Euro-American discipline. It's kind of the people who are kind of vaulted in our field, they cite continental philosophy. They cite European philosophy. So if I were to say, I want to cite George Jackson instead of Foucault, it would be, well, why not? Why not Foucault? Foucault has wrote the text on discipline, on discipline and punishment, right? And I'm like, but he was actually in California in the Bay Area as the Black Panthers were fighting against the state. And that kind of helped him think through his own ideas of discipline and punishment in his own work. So I think that part of me learning about Black studies and learning about Black study, it just showed me that in many ways, the work of Black study becomes kind of compromised and kind of figured fungibly into the apparatus of what anthropological knowledge and epistemology actually is. And that's why I feel that, no, there should never be there shouldn't be a wonderful, we're gonna work together. We have different projects all together as I see it. And I think that in many ways, that's why it has to be a space where we can be always it can be a productive antagonism. It can be but it needs to be an antagonism because I think that many anthropologists assume that they're doing liberatory, emancipatory work. And I think that's kind of the underlying assumption of coming from a genealogy that ties itself back to Franz Boas. I think that, no, we can't stop that. We can't do that anymore. We can't kind of move on that pretense any longer. And we have to think about really how is anthropology implicated in the kind of the racial ordering of humanness in our world right now. And how does anthropology implicated in it? And how does anthropological practice is practiced in North American and European universities perpetuating that process? And then how do we undermine that? I think about, in my own university, where I teach at, there's not one African-American student in the entire graduate program. And this is in Atlanta, Georgia. And I think that's, of course, that's intentional. And it's also a result of just the fact that, you're not recruiting people from certain areas, you're not recruiting people from certain institutions. So I think that our own modes of thinking through elitism, prestige, all those things all filter into how this becomes a white dominant environment in a white public space. And I think that's part of what I think Black Studies always cautions us against. And I think there's a work from Sylvia Winter I always go back to called On How We Mistook the Territory, the Map for the Territory. I think that in many ways, she talks about how with Black Studies emerged as a response to the 1960s. And I see now so many job calls coming out as a response to the George Floyd, this kind of summer protest movement. But that was never designed to get more tenure track faculty into universities. And that's boom, we've done our job. I think the people on the streets are doing the work of putting us in this position to be able to get these positions. And we have to honor their sacrifice and what they're doing in the street by doing work that pairs itself alongside with what they're doing. I think that in many ways, the job calls I see going out are just going to find, I do research on Black people, but it's not Black studies work. And I think that because we're rendered so fungible within the white academy, it doesn't matter if where I come from, what I do, what my research analytics are, I'm a Black face, I can do this kind of work for the university and I can get fit in. And I think that's my kind of, my antagonism with the academy and with anthropology itself is because, I'm not here to do work that is to teach white people to see non-white people as human beings. I feel that I'm being tasked to do that. And I think that's why I tend to agree with Ryan Jobson in his articulation of anthropology and it burning.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Justin. I know we have 7 minutes left. Deland, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. And then I'm going to ask one more question. I'll try to condense them together.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So Justin, I wholeheartedly agree with you, and I fully co-sign what Ryan Jobson laid out as well. But the one thing, I don't know if it's necessarily pushing back, but I think maybe to complicate it a little more, I think this antagonistic relationship is with what Amy Meredith Cox called in her great piece in Transforming Anthropology recently, the capital A anthropology. The type of anthropology or the field of anthropology that that hangs on to these liberal trends, and very often that light script they have on it oftentimes reinscribes the same colonialist tenets that founded the discipline to begin with, right? So that capital A anthropology, the anthropology that allows for white anthropologists to think that race doesn't matter in our dialogues, the type of anthropology where hopefully I don't get in trouble for saying this, but where in our association, executive leadership decontextualizes the language of leading Black feminist scholars to weaponize against precarious PhD candidates, right? But for the lowercase a anthropology, if you will, to extend that metaphor, an anthropology as a practice, an anthropology as a method, and again, thinking with Amy Meredith Cox here, anthropology as a mode of doing Black study, I think that I think that's a little separate from that relationship, because it predates the capital A anthropology. And to extend the metaphor of anthropology burn, that type of anthropology for me, I don't know if that's burnable per se. Itself is oftentimes the spark that ignites so many new and creative ways of thinking and doing and researching. So yeah, that's why I was going to add that to what you said.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to try to condense these last two questions into one. We have a graduate student, Tiffany Snowden, asks, what is it that sustains you on knowing that you're fighting up against all these challenges within the discipline, and what continues to keep you moving forward? And then Dr. Alondra Nelson asked, what theories and concepts are you all working on currently? I know Ayanna and I just came from the Archaeology of Redress panel. Justin Hosby's been doing work in Black Ecologies. If others want to speak on that topic, I'm gonna say if you can in 1 minute. I know that's like unrealistic, but I love y'all and I want all y'all to be able to speak. So thank you.
I'll hurry. So one of the things that sustained me last year when I was able to procure the minority dissertation fellowship, which one helped fueled me and letting me know, yes, I am an anthropologist, even though I came late to the game, and we need, this is why grants, scholarships, awards need to kind of pay attention to who are applying, because sometimes the go-to people gets the same awards, and having been on the awards committee, I've seen that. And but what happened in that after the ceremony is what stuck with me, and that is because people of color, especially Black women, came up to me and were saying, I'm so glad I got to see you. I now know I can do this. I now see that you were able to do it siloed off in the PWI with no, not a lot of help sometimes, and you stay Black all the way, right? Like, I get that. And when I hear that, that says, you know what, it's not just about me. This is bigger than me. All my battles is to open up. Like, I break through a door and I leave it open for 5 other people. I've done my job.
Beautiful. Who wants to take the next one?
Okay, I got a timer going for 1 minute. But no, I wanted to say that, part of, for Dr. Nelson's question, I'm thinking about my own work. Me and Professor J.T. Rohn at Arizona State, we kind of co-edited this project called the Black Ecologies Project. And part of what that is I think us both being scholars who are of the South and from the South, who are committed to kind of doing work in Southern communities, we think about kind of at a time in which, so many communities in the South, particularly Black and Indigenous communities in the South, are really facing the brunt of climate change and what's happening in the South. How can we think through kind of Black and Indigenous ways of knowing and being in sustainability to actually think about how we can survive and thrive beyond kind of like the forces of capital that kind of put us in positions where we're marked as vulnerable and expendable in our environment? So part of that is kind of doing work, it goes across different disciplines and humanities, social sciences, think through how do kind of Black people in these Southern communities have ways of thinking about sustainability, about knowledge production, and also about the environment that can provide us possible futures beyond just the kind of racial capitalist scene as Francois Verge described it.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And I'll hop in to say, to Snowden, I'm going back to Tiffany and just saying that you got to find your squad. I feel like the only thing that made this space breathable for me is the work that I've been doing alongside Justin and other really brilliant Black archaeologists in the formation of SBA. Within my own research, I'm really building off of the work of Maria Franklin as well as Whitney Battle Baptiste, and expanding Black feminist archaeology to really think through how Black women from enslavement through freedom within the African diaspora were adorning their bodies to meet their everyday to meet negotiations of racism, sexual violence, economic exploitation that sort of garnered and shaped their everyday lives. So that's the work that I'm doing, and I'm pulling on, as I mentioned, a number of different scholars to do that in the same, framework that Whitney outlines in her book, calling this a methodological gumbo. It's really a weaving together of so many different frameworks to make the interior lives of Black women visible through the material that they wore on their bodies.
Beautiful. Thank you, Delon. You want to finish this up strong?
Okay, I'll try to be super quick. First, hey, Nelson. So what theories and what I'm trying to bring out of this rich intersection, I'm really trying to center, care as a method. It's from bell hooks to Christina Sharp, think of care as an ethic and as a practice. But what does care look like as a method? I oftentimes name my practice as an anthropology of Black remains. I study human remains from Atlas burial grounds, but also the remnants and residues of racial science. But also, I want to be invested in putting at the forefront of my work the way that Blackness remains, how in the wake of the plantation, in the afterlives of slavery, how it continues to persist and thrive and continue to be creative in so many ways, shapes, and forms. And that's not to offer like a romanticized resilience narrative, but just to state that Blackness continues to persist and thrive. Yeah, I want that to be at the forefront of my work.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending. I feel like I got to kick everybody out of the club, but this is a great conversation. It just started. Please reach out to us individually or collectively. I also dropped some links into Society of Black Archaeologists, the Association of Black Anthropologists. I hope you have a great weekend and continue to enjoy the rest of the sessions at the AAAs. Thank you all.